Hello there and welcome back to the channel. Today we're discussing the vertical warbird encountered in the 2380s by the unknown alien vessel that subsequently destroyed it. This is the first time we've seen a Romulan vessel with this particular hull configuration, and we're going to look at what exactly it is we can see about this vessel, what we know about it, and the history of this ship. Before we get started, like, share and subscribe. Comment down below your thoughts on this vessel. Do you prefer it over the original design of the Derridix class warbird or of this one? Is this a superior, more interesting looking vessel? Okay, so what do we know about the ship? Let's do a bit of out of universe lore for a second. The Romulan Warbird was designed by Andrew Probert. It's actually in my opinion, one of the finest designed vessels in the whole of Star Trek. It's menacing, it's very Romulan from its hull configuration, coloration, bird-like design, and general overbearing, great bear of a starship, which is, considering the Cold War analogies between the Federation and the Romulans is a pretty apt analogy, I think. The vessel just screams power and overwhelming force. Probert originally designed the Warbird with this vertical configuration, thinking it would make it more distinctive, more interesting looking, and a lot more alien. It also broke with the traditional trend of this sort of horizontal alignment of starships being wider and longer but with a more narrow forward profile. Thinking, well, there's no reason, there's no rule to say that they have to be that way, but like there's no rule that the bridge has to be at the top of the ship. He designed these vessels to be more unusual looking, however, multiple reasons, but one of the major ones why this wasn't gone with was actual cinematography. The filming models of the ships, if they'd have gone with the vertical one, it would have been very difficult to make these two ships, by two ships I mean the Enterprise D and this Romulan Warbird, appear in the same shot without the Enterprise looking ridiculously small, but also it would have made the Warbird look overbearingly more powerful compared to the Galaxy class ship, which would have been a much narrower, weedier ship compared to it, and it would have looked like it was just going to come smashing down on it like Thor's hammer. That's the reason that out of universe they didn't go with it, or one of the reasons. But in universe, which is more interesting to me, where does this ship land? Let's look at the timeline of Romulan vessels for a moment. From the 2360s, from their re-emergence, the first Derridix class warbird, encountered by the Enterprise D on the Romulan neutral zone investigating the disappearance of various colonies on both sides, was a large 1,200-meter-ish long vessel equipped with disruptors, torpedoes, and an advanced cloaking device, and was just, as I said, it was a powerhouse vessel. It was a re-emergence. It was a statement by the Romulan Empire that we are back, to quote them, and they came back with a vengeance. The Derridix class is an impressive looking ship. It would go on to participate in multiple wars and engagements of the Romulan Empire, against the Borg, against the Dominion, and against the Federation, and against the Klingons. We don't know much about the interim vessels that took place within the Empire between the late 23rd century with the Romulan adoption of the Katinga and D7 class variant that they used, up to this. There are of course many designs out there, but they're non-official, they're fan designs, so we don't know much about them. The Warbird didn't come out of a vacuum, however. It was clearly part of a wider design lineage. We do see a series of other vessels such as the Romulan scout ship and science vessel and shuttles, which all share the hull coloration, indication that they're built of the same materials as the Warbird, and they have a generally similar layout in terms of how the vessels come from a beak-like design to little wing-like struts, to placement of nacelles, and the general lack of a main deflector, and even in many cases the lack of what are obvious main impulse engines, which if you actually pay attention to a Warbird, it doesn't superficially seem to have any, even though clearly it must do. But that's besides the point. So where does this ship fall into that lineage? Because by the time you reach the 2380s, you see the Valdor class Warbird has become a more prominent vessel. This smaller, sleeker ship has replaced the more overbearing, domineering Warbird predecessors with this smaller, more maneuverable, smarter designed ship. Whether or not the Valdor class is truly an individually superior ship or is just something the Romulans can produce in larger numbers is an open debate in my opinion. But the Valdor class does seem to be a more sophisticated vessel, a more streamlined, more efficient design than the Warbird, which I think was built for a bit more versatility. So again, we fall back on where does this ship fit into that? It's definitely not a science vessel, it's definitely a military ship, but why is it orientated this way while all the other Romulan vessels, and I mean literally all of them, are orientated more like a bird, with this ship more having a sort of general beak-like configuration in general, but although it's still wing-like, with the orientation of the head still being horizontal, the drive section, compared to where the engines and everything are being placed dorsally and vertically above it and below it. It's a very different looking ship. And although, again, some designs indicate this ship could have been about the same size as a typical Romulan Warbird, it's not entirely clear from when we see it. See, we only see this ship in comparison to a small alien ship, which we don't know much about, including how big it actually is. And also, perspective is important in space. We don't know how close these ships are to one another or far apart. We don't know its full capabilities. It's reasonable to conclude that it's got disruptors and torpedoes, probably a cloaking device, certainly have shields and other base technologies we know the Romulans utilize. But in universe, I think the reason the Romulans would build a ship like this, I think, is as much about intimidation as it is anything else. And bear with me. The Romulan Warbird is a beast of a ship, the Dideridates class specifically. But the Valdor class is a smarter design that came out of the repercussions of the Romulan Dominion War. It taught the Romulans they needed smarter ships that could be built quicker. The Warbirds, although very big and very imposing, have a lot of weaknesses. That big negative space, kind of a waste of, well, space. They are very powerful, but they're not as heavily armed as they could be. They're almost a ship that's daring you to fight it, but it has much more potential than it actually gives off. It looks stronger than it realistically probably is. And that's not to say that a Romulan Warbird is not an incredibly powerful ship, because it certainly is. But I think the Valdor class was a natural step in scaling back the unnecessary trimmings of the vessel to be a more efficient warship, pure warship, because I don't think the Dideridates class is a pure warship. We know the Romulans use them for research purposes and scientific missions as well. Meaning the Romulans were taking a leaf out of the Federation's book, but they went big, and they went deliberately big. And I think this ship, although it's still deliberately very large and very big, its configuration is as much about intimidation. That reorientation makes the ship look like it's almost like a gigantic sort of, for lack of a term, beak or pincer coming down on you. It's different, it's very alien looking. It looks taller rather than wider. And as your ship is already quite wide, suddenly you face a vessel that's now taller than you. I mean, you could reason that you could make the argument that if you reorientated the Dideridates class Warbird to go on its side, because there's no up or down in space, you'd accomplish the same goal, but a person looking at it would naturally flip their head to the side to see the Warbird the correct way round. With this vessel, they'd be seeing it the correct way round, and it would just be a big, intimidating vessel. I can't think of a tactical reason why the ship is improved for this particular design, because if you actually look at it, it's got the same negative space as a standard Dideridates class. It looks to be about the same sort of size. They don't seem to be gaining anything for the engine placements being top and bottom rather than left and right. It doesn't seem to have gained any additional systems or weapons emplacements. Perhaps the drive section, the head, the command section, looks a little beefier, maybe, but I don't think it really is. I can't think of a tactical reason other than for intimidation, and perhaps something to do with the warp field. Maybe the ship's built to be faster. Maybe something about the placement of the engines in relation to where the warp drive and power systems are makes for a more stable warp field. We do know that Romulan vessels do lack in this area. They're not as fast as their Federation or even Klingon counterparts. It's possible it could have been an experimental design that the Romulans simply put into service. There are numerous reasons why the Romulans may have done it, but I can't think of a good tactical one, personally. Now, of course, Romulans don't think like humans, and me being human, I can't think like a Romulan, so there could be another actual legitimate engineering purpose. There could have been engineering principles that went into this ship that gave it certain advantages in certain situations over other vessels and certain tactical situations, but for the life of me, I can't think what they are because of the scaling. If they were smaller, it'd make more sense. Or even if it was bigger, I could see reasons, but it just doesn't seem to actually get anything. That said, I do really love the design. I always liked the vertical ship. Ever since I first saw the blueprints for one, I always wanted to see one, and I'm really, really happy that we got to see one, and that the Romulans actually adopted this design for one reason or another. It could simply be a variant of the Diderotix class built for some other tailor-specific purpose, very limited, because we do know that there clearly aren't as many of these things because the Romulans weren't fielding as many of them. It could be the replacement of the Diderotix as they were phasing it out, not just the Valdor coming in to replace it, but maybe this thing. That's a possibility. But again, I question why they flipped the hull 90 degrees. It doesn't really seem to serve a purpose. It could reasonably, maybe, be that when the ship's being attacked, the Romulans registered that where the engines were was a natural targeting location, and maybe the enemies were going for them. Maybe this alignment allows them to give better protection, put armor in the places where the ship is actually being constantly attacked from, but you'd think that'd be a relatively easy adjustment for the enemies to deal with. So I don't really know. If anyone out there's got a better idea as to why you might orientate this vessel, what they're actually gaining for it, because I can't think... There's nothing that you gain from this you couldn't simply do to a standard Diderotix class. Maybe it's a little bigger, or maybe it's smaller than a Diderotix class, because it is difficult to tell without seeing it literally side by side with one, or getting some schematics for the ship, but getting schematics on specific Romulan vessels for the Federation, so we can have a look at them, which is obviously how we get them, really, is not easy. The Romulans don't exactly share schematics for their prized warships. I think, personally, it's more about intimidation than it is about efficiency of design. I think it's more about experimentation with possible reconfiguration for future generations of vessels. It could be limited purpose, specific, very tailor-made purpose of use. It could be a maneuvering thing. There could be literally thousands of subtle differences with which this ship gains certain advantages in very unique situations, but perhaps they're not unique enough or common enough, those situations, to justify the mass production of this vessel, meaning its more limited production. It could also be a discarded, older design. This could actually be just something the Romulans still had floating around from the intermittent years before the rise of the Diderotix, and for whatever reason they actually reorientated the other way and made it more conventional, horizontal layout of a starship rather than the less conventional vertical layout. Because when you start to think about what this would do to the internal layout of the ship, you start thinking about deck layouts. You can no longer, you'd have two deck sixes, for example. A deck 6 in one side, in one wing, and a deck 6 in the other. They're not connected together anywhere other than the nacelles and the neck sections connecting to the command section. So moving from one side to the other is no more difficult than moving from the dorsal to the ventral part of a Diderotix class, but it does sort of, because of the orientation of where the gravity plating would be and everything else, you would have a complete change internally with the ship, which, thinking about it, might actually possibly present certain advantages to internal layout for security and defensive purposes for boarding actions that perhaps this was a consideration with this design, which might actually, maybe, have just stumbled on the reason. But let me know in the comment section below whether you love or hate this design, whether you think the Romulans really needed to build it. Was it experimental? Was it a replacement? Was it older, just refitted and kept around? Or what are your thoughts on how exactly and why you would change the basic schematics of your most common ship to now fit this new hull configuration? Let me know in the comment section below.